10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and ladies and gentlemen, sorry about that, I thought the TV was on. So, welcome, like I said again, for those of you, if any of you walked in a little bit late like I did, thank you for being here. I appreciate you being here. And again, I know a lot of you, your brains are fried from AP exams, so I extra appreciate you being here. Reminder about what the test is going to be like a week from Thursday. You're going to show up at 7:30. You're going to make sure you find your name on the library. You're going to go to that classroom and stand outside. I will be walking around, high-fiving you, getting you as pumped up as you possibly can be at 7:30 in the morning on a late start. You will then be going in, getting ready, filling out your answer keys, all that fun stuff that standardized testing does that many of you did today. And you are starting with the multiple choice. You have 55 minutes to answer 55 multiple choice questions. Again, each multiple choice question will have some sort of stimulus, some sort of document, be it written or visual, to help stimulate you and help you remember what it is that you have been learning about. So as we look at this document, there's a few things that you should note. Even before you start reading the whole thing, it's good to look at what the source is. And so we see this one is Har Dayal, a South Asian, by the way, let's just restore my faith in humanity here. South Asia is? India. Nice! Knew I could count on all of you. South Asian activist. Speech to the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, meeting in Oakland, California in 1912. Industrial Workers of the World was a trade union, otherwise known as, and you'll learn about them in APUS next year, they're called the Wobblies, which is funny. But anyway, the IWW is an international trade union. Off the bat, you probably can guess what about this document. If it's a trade union, what can you guess? What? It'll probably have something to do with the economy and... Ladies and gentlemen, 1912, industrial workers means it's going to be what time period? The Industrial Revolution. One of the things you know as an impact of the Industrial Revolution are poor working conditions. In response to poor working conditions, you had trade unions that wanted to fight for the rights of workers. Heavily influenced by the ideas of Marx, and especially, Dylan.
Why are you calling me out?
Because we just talked about this.
Socialism.
Thank you! Heavily influenced by the ideas of socialism. Any of you said fascism for that. Okay, so, back here, please. Remember, when you're going through these multiple choice questions, it is important to make sure that you know the source. It is important that you make sure you read the document. But remember, the document is meant to be a stimulus. Don't spend all your time trying to analyze the document extremely closely because sometimes the questions will only vaguely have to do with the document. So, you read through this, you know it has something to do with trade unions, you know it's during the modern era, you know there's industrialization, so that should help spark your mind and help you get ready for these questions. The speech by Hardayal is most clearly an example of which of the following? You go through all of the possible answers, and then you decide which ones it certainly cannot be. Eliminate the ones that you know for sure are not good. Which ones can it not be here? Which is one that it cannot be? Can't be B, why? Millennial religious beliefs. By the way, millennial religious beliefs is kind of a weird, specific thing. Millennial people are not, when we say millennials, as in like all of you that are obsessed with your cell phones, when we say millennials in history, we're talking about people who believe in the end of the world. Who believe that the end of the world is coming and B can't be the answer. Some of you are thinking, I thought today was the end of the world. But the idea is B cannot be the answer. Which one can also not be the answer? Probably not A. Why? Because there's a trade union called the Industrial Workers of the World. Why would industrial workers not want to be industrial workers? Yes, but the idea is they're not trying to go back to farming. They're trying to improve their lot now. Good. So it can't be A. It can't be C. Can't be C either. Can't be C either. It is D. Groups forming to advocate for alternatives to capitalist society. Ladies and gentlemen, when I give answers, it shouldn't spark you to automatically talk to your neighbor. So remember, we want to stay focused. We want to actually hear what I'm saying. I know you're all kind of loopy because of AP Chem, but do your best to focus. And AP Psychology. I know AP Psych is good. That's how it's pronounced. There's a CH in there. People have been pronouncing it wrong for years. So, you know it has to be D because, ladies and gentlemen, the industrial workers of the world as trade unions, that's exactly what trade unions did. The whole point of trade unions was to advocate for alternatives to capitalist society, particularly influenced by socialism. Based on the speech, the IWW was an example of which of the following? Oh, great. Yeah, okay. Which one can it be? What can it not be? Anyone? Bueller? Bueller? It can't be A. Why not? Yeah, well, the Enlightenment was a while ago, and this isn't a document talking about political revolutions necessarily. Good. What else can it not be? Focus. Why not, Toby? Yeah, it doesn't say anything about the use of indentured labor industrial economy. Does that happen? Yes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That absolutely happens, but that's not what they're talking about in the document. Good. What else can it not be? What, Nate? Why not? Yeah, it doesn't talk about ethnic migrants. The only way you might have been able to make that jump is that he's an Indian speaking in Oakland, but that's not what he's talking about necessarily either. However, C is clearly the best answer there. What does a trade union talk about? A trade union is all about people with common economic interests who are trying to gain better rights for workers. So it's got to be C. I like this question. Number 20, which of the following best explains why Hardayal saw a link between the struggles of women and workers? Which can it not be? Why not A, Zach?
I did say A.
Yikes. Zach, why can't it be C?
Because it's B.
No, Zach, that's not an answer. You're right, but that's not an answer. Why can't it be C? The development of more effective means of birth control gave working class women more control over their economic lives. Well, they do have some birth control, but really, Birth control methods aren't going to be majorly improved until the 70s. It's still going to be not very good methods of birth control. I love how I say birth control on this side of the room. Birth control. K! What else can it be? What else can it not be? Why not? Shh, listen. Here's why it can't be A. This is a great question. Here's why it can't be A. It is true that in some colonized societies, women were taking on economic roles formerly occupied by men. That happens somewhat in Africa, but not necessarily everywhere in colonies. So it's not A necessarily, but A would have been a second best choice, I think, on this one. By the way, why can't it be D? And what happened before World War II? What happened before the Great Depression? There you go. And World War I. Yes, but when does World War I start? 1914 is when World War I starts. Woo! It's been a long day. Okay, so 1912 is before that. That's the only reason why it can't be D. And so it is B. Excluded from full participation. Now, think. The push for workers' rights is similar for the push for women's rights in what or for what? Not for work. For voting. For suffrage. Nice, Alan. It's their fight for suffrage. Now, here's the idea. You got to think context. Because while workers are fighting for rights in factories, women are continuously kept out of that. The middle class, because, and we're going to talk about who the middle class is, because women in the middle class actually had more time to devote to their things outside of the home, largely because of technology, they begin to fight for the right to vote. That struggle very much so mimics the struggle that workers had in order to gain rights. Both are fighting against the very traditional political establishment, trying to gain rights for themselves and utilizing their voice. So that's why there's that. That's why there's that carryover, and that actually is one of my favorite questions in this whole document. And number 21 most clearly supports which of the following? Not fascism. It is socialism. But it's talking about the poor helping out the poor and essentially living in a sort of communal relationship.
But I thought it was kind of more like communism was based around economic.
Sure, that doesn't mean they're not fighting for it.
Okay. So
does that make sense? Yeah, well, it's 1912, so it's at a later stages of that. However, in Oakland, in California, you're not going to see as much respect for communism, and so you'll see moderate socialism being pushed for. Cool. Good! And the idea is the leaders come from the ranks, and the idea is everybody not focusing on those who are already above us. The idea of taking people who are part of the struggle and letting them lead. That's what I got from this one. Cool. Okay. I think. What time is it? I say we do another set of questions. right, go back to the Neo page. Go to resources. Go back to the Neo page. Go back to resources. Go to AP World History practice questions. Good. Go to resources. Go to the practice questions all the way at the bottom. I'm getting there. Nice. I would like you to do numbers. Shh, focus. I'd like you to do numbers 29 through 33. 29 through 33. It's Bartle Frere, British Governor of the Bombay Presidency, India. Speech on opening of a rail line, 1863. All those questions are connected. Not around that time. Gandhi would be in school. A little bit later it would be Gandhi. He might be at this point, he might actually be in law school at this point. Remember, you have no friends. Shh. Don't have friends. Nui, no friends. Keep going. By the way, if you're finding spaces, I'm sorry. It's usually F's and I's that are missing. So number 30 says the lifting Go ahead, take 30 seconds, share your answers. I'm assuming by the voices, you're done. And 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and here we go. Frere's speech is best understood in the context of which of the following? Which can it not be? My gosh, there's one that's just glaringly obvious in any understanding of imperialism. This just never happened. Say it, Rena. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Governments in Asian empires, that did happen. Japan, China, and Ottoman Empire. So that does happen in Asian empires, but that's not what they're talking about in India. So it can't be A. But what's the glaring one? Say it again? Yeah, D, Connor, exactly. Never, ever, ever, ever do European governments promote redistributionist policies, which means making everybody equal. No, they would not want that because that means that they would have to... No, they would not do... Good, so it can't be A, it can't be D. Which one, which other one can it not be? Yeah, it can't be B either. Mitigate? Make it easier? No! Europeans want to heighten those. Therefore, the answer is C. Now, eyes up here. Shh, focus. If you need to move away from some of your friends in order to stay quiet, do so now. Okay, so the whole idea of C being the answer is what do European powers use in order to consolidate their power? Why are they able to take control over such vast territories like India? Railroads, industrial technology, steamships, the ability to move around quickly, telegraph lines, the ability to communicate quickly. So using that technology is one of the ways that they will be able to maintain power over others. 30, the developments described in the speech regarding the lifting of traditional restrictions on Indian labor contributed most directly to which of the following global processes? If there's one thing I did not do well teaching in the modern era, it is this. However, if you think about even U.S. history, and you think about Ellis Island, and you think about Angel Island up in San Francisco, and you think about the history of labor even in the United States, you would have gotten this one. It can't be A, protests for improved sanitation in industrial cities. No, Indian labor has nothing to do with that. It's not going to be C, the decline of Spanish and Portuguese influence in the Indian Ocean. That happened way before this. It's not going to be, and D was close, but it's not D. Because the emergence of racial ideologies that supported European imperialism, that's not going to be the lifting of traditional restrictions. What will is the ability of Indians to move around different European empires and being contracted labor forces elsewhere. You're going to see a lot of Indians moving to South Africa because of their connection within the British Empire. Coerce means to force. Does that make sense? And then if you watched Gandhi last semester, that's exactly what Gandhi was fighting against. Cool? Good. 31. Which of the following best explains Frere's characterization of the time of his speech as the railway period in British India? Well, it's not A. It might have happened, but probably it's definitely not A. Railways allowed British missionaries to spread Christianity more effectively. Well, that's probably true. Maybe. And D, Railways easing the overcrowding of Indian cities by allowing industrial workers to commute to suburban areas. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the opposite. Railways take suburban workers and bring them to factories in urban areas. Does that make sense? So again, C, railways open up access to interior markets and resources for British commercial interests. Good. 32. Freer's view of the changing opportunities in Indian labor most directly reflects the influence of which of the... Oh my gosh. Influence of which of the following? Dylan. Do not say socialism. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to think, whose ideas that I sang to you in class, whose ideas that I lulled you to are the ones that are going to support European capitalist enterprises? Do not say Karl Marx. I did not sing Karl Marx to you, Abigail. I sang to you laissez-faire and how Uncle Adam whispered to you, let it be. I'll sing it later. No. Ladies and gentlemen, I was up here because this is something that probably would have tripped you up. It probably would have tripped you up. The term liberal today means something vastly different to what it meant in the 19th century. Mr. DeVries is a liberal. And for those of you in the Entrepreneurship Academy, you're giggling. No, he's not, right? Mr. DeVries is a classical liberal who believes in personal freedoms and who believes in freedom of trade. Free trade, government staying out of business, laissez-faire. That is liberal economic policies. Does that make sense? So liberalism is the answer. Even if you didn't know liberalism, because that's not necessarily a word, and you forgot that I sang to you about how Uncle Adam whispers to you, let it be, you would have definitely known it can't be communism. It can't be necessarily enlightenment because Simón Bolívar has nothing to do with this. And it's definitely not mercantilism because that was the early modern period, not the modern period. Does that make sense? Good. Last one. Which of the following later developments would most undermine the hopes set forth by Freer in the last sentence of his speech? Last sentence. That was a key thing to make sure you were reading the questions correctly. It's not going to be easier access to Indian raw materials because it's not talking about how the Indian's going to be a great subject and a wonderful worker. It's not going to be the Japanese emulation of Western models because that's not going to undermine his hopes. It may or may not be C, and it's definitely not going to be D. So it's going to be C. Because the idea is with improved communication, listen, with improved communication and improved transportation, there will finally in India be a sense of Indian nationalism. For the majority of India's history, they have been decentralized and a place of extreme cultural diversity. But when the British take control and begin to identify Indians as something separate from themselves, they create a national identity for India. And so people are able to share more easily the things that they have in common. And that's when you're going to have leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, like Swami Vivekananda, like Mahatma Gandhi, who are going to be able to easily begin to promote this idea of Indian nationalism that does the exact opposite of making the Indian a good subject and a good worker. Does that make sense? Clear? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we'll transition into our wonderful little presentation on the modern era. Again, just to remind you how these sorts of things go, I'm going to be talking to you about the major trends that happen. I'll be pointing out things that you should be focusing your study on. I will go into some detail. I will go into some stories just to try to help you remember things, and I'll do my best to keep it interesting. What you want to do, and what I see most of you doing right now, is have something to write. If something doesn't sound familiar, if you say, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. Or if it's something that I say, I didn't cover well in class, that's something you want to write down as well. So I'll give you a second to transition. Also, as I transition and get some water as well. Uh-huh. Okay. I need one more sip. Georgia. If it's not, it will be. Probably resources, but I'm not sure. If it's not under the resources, then I probably have to put it up there, and I'll get it up. Oh, yes, it would be probably review session 1750 to 1940. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are transitioning into the modern era today. Now, when we look at the modern era, this is when things start to really make sense. This is when students typically begin to relate a little bit more to the content, largely because it's the ideas of the modern era that have really set the stage for the way that our world works today. And you, as students who grew up, for the most part, in a Western education system, you have been taught these ideas that come out of modernity since you were little. Yes, there are going to be some shifts and changes when we talk next week about the postmodern era, but really you're going to start to see things sound familiar. In addition, a lot of the quote-unquote issues that we have today can trace their roots all the way back to things that happened in the modern era, particularly the development of European imperialism. One of the first things I started my class out with is how we hate Eurocentrism. We hate the fact that Europe is always central to everything that we study. I mean, even our time periods are revolving around when Europe had its glory days. You have the classical era, which is Rome, and everything else is either before it or after it. And now you have the modern era, when Europe comes to dominate the world. And you have the early modern and postmodern, when Europe loses its control. So clearly we see evidence of Eurocentrism within our own study of history. And again, if you're going to talk, I'm going to ask you to just kindly go. Because if you're going to distract, it's going to make me yell louder, and I don't have the voice for that right now. So when we look at the modern era, we have to understand that one of the reasons why the modern era is significant is because Europeans come to define what it means to be modern. This is going to be when Europe really goes from just playing a sort of middleman role in global politics and comes to dominate that. So when we look at our theme of the modern era, which is going to separate from globalization and kind of go, what does it mean to be modern, or what is modernity, we have to really focus a lot of our attention on understanding European developments and how the rest of the world reacts to that. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. What does it mean to be modern? By the way, if you had Miss Jacobson, you probably watched the fun Charlie Chaplin video on industrialization. That's one of my favorite videos she shows. I really like that. But you can see here, Charlie Chaplin, the guy in the Montecito Inn, right, with the really famous mustache that was made famous by another guy in the postmodern era that we don't like as much. But Charlie Chaplin, a famous silent film actor, probably because he had a terrible voice. Anyway, he does a funny thing on factory work, and then that's what that looks like. So when we look at Europe and we look at modernity, we know that it is Europe that comes to define what it means to be modern. And why? Because there's going to be major shifts that give Europe the edge all over other societies. And really what Europe claims to have superiority for is, number one, the fact that they become a quote-unquote enlightened society. Towards the end of the early modern era, you see the developments of the scientific revolution, which then transitioned into applying scientific logic and reasoning using observation and evidence, and applying that to human society. And any sort of human structures need to make sense. They need to be logical. They need to be reasonable. And so you see philosophers begin to try to create this ideal society that would be the most natural for humans. A society that is organized along scientific principles or principles of nature. And so Europeans think that they have created this society, or have at least started to create this society. In addition, In addition, the scientific revolution doesn't really ever stop. It just gets applied more and more. And what you see happening in Europe is an explosion of technological innovation that changes the global economy for the rest of history. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is probably one of the biggest events in world history. If you think of major events, the Agricultural Revolution is one, when humans stop hunting and gathering, and then you have all of that time where humans are relying on agriculture, and then 1750 hits. And no longer do all societies focus on agricultural production. You now have societies that are focused on industrial production, which, by the way, means what is that? What is industry? Factories. Yes. What does that mean, Bianca? What do you mean? Doing what? Good. Yeah, machines doing stuff. Yes, Bianca. The idea is that you have the world going away from hand producing goods, making things by hand, slowly and painstakingly, to using machines in order to mass produce goods. And this is going to make major shifts and changes for all of humanity. My personal favorite is the fact that many goods became more widely available for people. And my favorite good that becomes more widely available is underwear. Because underwear, thank goodness, is finally available for all of us, even teachers. Underwear is something that was only around for the rich. And thank goodness we all can wear that, because otherwise this classroom would be way stinkier. So, an enlightened society also, just to know, European modernity also means a democratized society, a society that allows for more and more citizen participation in the government. Now, democracy and Enlightenment thinking doesn't really get applied easily. So we're going to see that democracy really comes out in a very bloody way. Europe doesn't just all of a sudden get an easy transition into power. And in fact, Europe has to go through its own sort of growing pains before it can start to develop its own modernity. You have to start, and this time period does start, with our favorite democratic revolutions. Revolutions that happen around the Atlantic world, that start with the United States and the American War for Independence, goes to France, then that goes into Latin America, or goes to Haiti, which then extends into Latin America. And you're going to see these revolutions applying those ideals of the Enlightenment. And I'll just go through a few of these. Now, when you look at these revolutions, something just to remember. They all have, and some of you are going to laugh because you're going to remember this quiz question. They all have a common vocabulary. Something that's very unique is they all happen in European-dominated areas. And one of the things that they share is that Enlightenment vocabulary, that vocabulary of natural rights, that vocabulary of a social contract, that vocabulary of freedom of speech, freedom of religious tolerance, or excuse me, not tolerance, toleration, which is a word I've checked. Religious toleration. All of these things that come out of the Enlightenment movement from Western Europe and then spread around the European-controlled world are going to spark these quote-unquote revolutions. The first is the U.S. Revolution. It is a revolution. I mean, when you think revolution, really, you think things are going to change, right? And when you see the American colonies, really does anything change? You have a bunch of property white men who are used to dominating colonial policies. Then King George decides to actually pay attention to his colonies, like a parent who never pays attention to their kid and then tries to say, no, you can't go out past 10 p.m., but I always do. And well, you have these property white men in the colonies who don't want to pay taxes to a king they've never seen, and they say, no! And what do? They keep power. Nothing changes, really. However, we do call it the American Revolution, and in U.S. history next year, you'll debate that with Mr. Horn or Mr. Eisen or Mr. Mooneyham, whoever you get the blessing of having. The second revolution happens in France, and this is probably the most influential to European and Western politics, because France probably represented one of the most conservative monarchies in Europe, and probably one of the most centralized monarchies in Europe. You should remember from the early modern era, this is the time period of absolute monarchy. And the pinnacle, the coolest, the best absolute monarch who had total control, also had the best calves in Europe, and that was Louis XIV. He was a dancer, he liked to dance ballet, and every single painting of him accentuates his calves in tights. And yes, he wears high heels in order to accentuate that, We understand, right? So Louis XIV is the pinnacle of an absolute monarch. His grandson is an absolute schlub and has no idea how to do anything. And because of that's actually what his dad's mistress called him, was a fat and ill-bred schlub. Yes. Of the best calves in Europe? I'll let you Google that later, but just make sure Safe Search is on it. Yes, Tommy. What? So, with the French Revolution, you have Louis XVI, who is just... actually, I take it back. His father's mistress called him a fat, ill-bred boy. I believe his actual mother might have called him a schlub. Anyway, so Louis XVI was somebody who should not be in control of France, and because of financial mismanagement, because of a growing merchant class, and largely because of environmental factors that were out of his control, you see a revolution developing in France that winds up cutting the heads off of both Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette, and brings about radical shift in France for about 5 years. Until France then actually goes back to another monarchy. They actually elect a monarchy again. And even before that, you have a dictator named Napoleon who takes over France and spreads enlightenment by force, which is always interesting. You then have the Haitian Revolution as Napoleon takes over in France and begins to conquer around Europe because he has little man syndrome and he has something to prove. As Napoleon begins to conquer around Europe, he begins to disrupt European politics. Don't look at Ryan. He gets European politics. He begins to disrupt things, and so the Haitian Revolution happens after you see France being disrupted and slavery being declared illegal in France, and the slaves of Haiti, of course, decide to revolt after they try to keep slavery in Haiti, and you see the first ever successful black slave revolution. Then Latin America, as Napoleon then conquers Spain and puts his little brother in control of Spain, Latin America decides to also revolt against its Spanish rulers, and they declare themselves independent, largely due to the work of this man, Simón Bolívar, and another man named José de San Martín, who are two Creole generals who band together and essentially kick all of the Spanish out. And so, other than the French, these are all of those American colonies that Europe had control over. By 1830, Europeans no longer have control over Latin America or anywhere else in the Americas. Canada, save Canada, but of course. Last but not least, something I want you to know about the revolutions, and I think this goes into my so what. Oh, nice, good. So what? Who cares about all of these revolutions? By the way, I've given you extremely quick, absurdly fast descriptions of these revolutions. You're going to want to know the main ideas of each of them. So that's something that you'll want to make sure that you study in the modern era, because they are foundational to the development of Europe. So if you want to star those, that might be a good idea. But the so what? Number one, something that you have to understand, the modern era is the era of the bourgeoisie. How bougie. It is the era of the bourgeoisie. This is the era of the middle class. And yes, before the AP exam, figure out how to spell bourgeoisie, even though spelling doesn't count. But figure out how to spell bourgeoisie, because if you have to write, it doesn't. If you have to write an essay on the modern era, you better use bourgeoisie. That's an excellent, excellent, excellent evidence point. Right? So this is the era of the middle class. There would be no revolution if it wasn't for the middle class wanting more control. For the history of European society, it has always been the landed nobility, the aristocracy, who were born wealthy and whose wealth came from their own estates. The middle class, thanks to the explosion of trade during the early modern era, are becoming more and more prominent. And don't forget, European monarchies had a close relationship to merchants in order to combat the power of the aristocracy. So merchants are wanting more and more representation, and particularly since anybody not part of the aristocracy is treated like a second-class citizen. And so they are going to want more and more rights. So all of these revolutions benefit the middle class in particular. Like I said before, they're all inspired by Enlightenment values. They challenge aristocracy, religion, and quote-unquote tradition. which is most notably monarchy. I love this picture. I love this picture. Oh, maybe it's not this one. One of my favorite pictures of the French Revolution is it's just like a guy holding King Louis's hand, just like, here, guys, and the crowd's going, yay! Anyway, it's always fun when the French execute each other. Okay, creates expectation that government is, creates expectation that governments are representatives of the people. This idea of the social contract, this idea from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that the government should represent the people. All of these revolutions challenge that notion and say that the monarchies that were the traditional monarchies of Europe were not representing the people. And this is their way of violently saying, hey, 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 listen to us! And if you don't, we'll cut off your head. But the idea is that a government should represent the people. That's going to play a huge role as European politics and really global politics begin to progress through the modern era. And then again, this causes, quote unquote, the democratization of European politics. Now, something to be very aware of. I put that in quotes on purpose because after all of these revolutions, things largely don't change. We study them as things that changed everything, but really they don't. The wealthy are still maintaining power. Slavery may become abolished eventually because of the ideas of equality and because of other factors as well. But largely, those who were formerly slaves, their lives are still going to be miserable and they're barely going to be able to survive. Women are still going to be excluded from politics until after World War I. There. The periodization, the one we're going to study tonight. I would say at that point in time, things largely stay the same. But I would definitely explain how the middle class gains more and more prominence, but I would say things largely don't change for the average person. But it is the start to changes that are going to become way more important later on. Sarah, on that essay in particular, that is one that you could probably argue either way and be fine. Not all of the periodization essays are created equally like that, but that one, either way you argue, would be historically accurate. Because you have historians who say that the French Revolution is the single biggest defining moment in European history, especially French historians. The French. Okay. Where's Abigail? Don't tell your dad that, because then my favorite history teacher, my second favorite history teacher from Westmont will get really mad at me. Dr. Robbins, don't let her do that. Okay, and let me talk about abolition of slavery. Oh, good! I forgot the so what. One of the biggest things that you see coming out of these revolutions, is a shift in European identity. This is largely due to Napoleon. So as Napoleon takes over for the French Revolution, he begins to expand France's influence politically all around Europe. They will conquer the Spanish. They will conquer the Italians. They will not conquer the Egyptians. They screw up in Egypt. They will conquer the German people. They will go all the way into Russia. By the way, word of the wise, please don't ever invade Russia in the fall. I wouldn't even do it in the summer because it'll probably take you a long time and then you'll be stuck in Russia in the middle of winter and you will die. Don't do it. Napoleon did it. It was his downfall. So Hitler does it in World War II. It's his downfall. Don't attack Russia. So you just don't do it. No, you can attack Russia. Spring and make it quick.
You have to retreat.
Yeah. Or just learn how to ski. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you're looking at this, as Napoleon conquers outwards, you see people getting upset at this. And because Napoleon, a Frenchman, who is controlling German territory, people of Germany see themselves as a banded group of people who need to kick out the French foreign invaders. By having a common enemy in Napoleon, you see people creating a common identity. This is where nationalism is going to develop and start. It comes out of these revolutions. So not only is it we're proud to be French because we had the French Revolution and we're a shining light to Europeans, it's also we're German and we hate the French. And positive views of yourself. Yes?
Why is that nutritional model? Like, is it bad?
Nationalism is bad. Is this one?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Some people think nationalism is a form of identity. I mean, really what you got to look at is this is a shift of European identity. European identity used to be in your specific area, your region, your village. Then it turns into your religion. You are Catholic, you are Protestant, and now it's going to turn from Catholic, Protestant to your nation. You are a German, not a Protestant. Does that make sense? Okay, good question. Ladies and gentlemen, industrialization. The first question you want to ask yourself when we look at industrialization, and like we said about industrialization, it is the shift. It is the shift of manually producing goods by hand to mass producing goods using machines. And the first question you want to ask is, what the heck? Why Europe? Really? Europe? Out of all of the civilizations in history, why would Europe be the one that has this technological explosion? China, Islam, I get. Not Europe. So something that's interesting to note about Europe is really its geography. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm continuing to teach. By now, you should have realized that it's time to be quiet. And seriously, if you can't sit next to your friends, don't. So, why Europe? We're looking at, number one, geography. You got to go back to Jared Diamond as you're thinking about why Europe, because it really is Europe's location that does so. Number one, you're going to see the fact that it has a location next to a lot of waterways, a lot of easy access to trade. Before they start using steam engine, the first way that they're going to use machines is through water power. And water mills, and then eventually they'll figure out windmills, and then eventually they'll figure out steam. In addition, they also have access to abundant resources, particularly resources that are going to be very useful, like coal and oil and things that are going to be used, these fossil fuels that are going to be used for that. I don't know what I meant by features, but I probably just meant something really good. There is a sense of Europeanness. This idea that Europeans naturally compete with each other and have this idea that wanting to win and beat out, largely because they're coming from these small fragmented states. And small fragmented states have been competing with each other for centuries. And so because of that competition, there is that drive. I'm not saying it's the best argument, I'm saying that is a argument that is out there. Is that Europeanness, which isn't a word, by the way. Don't write that in your essay. You would say Europeanness. Agricultural productivity. A major reason for why Europe is able to have an industrial revolution actually starts with an increase in the production of agriculture first. Europe had largely been using the same agricultural techniques. I mean, we're talking like since the agricultural revolution, same techniques. But eventually, they begin to develop other techniques because of their connection to the outside world, Persian windmills. Eventually, they'll learn crop rotation. They will also learn how to use nitrogen-rich plants in order to enrich the soil instead of just letting the soil grow fallow. But because of increased agricultural productivity, you see an increase in the population. And with a population increase and an ability to produce more agriculture more efficiently, you're going to see more people with less need to work in agriculture, which means you have more people who are looking for a job. And so you have a ready and willing labor force who is eager to do this and who are already beginning to move to cities in order to find more work. And agricultural productivity is actually really fun. In Britain, you actually start to see fairs happening where they begin to compete for who's got the biggest cows. So if you look up some fun pictures of 18th century European cows, you'll see these massive cows that basically look like squares. Where is it? Hopefully this isn't a permanent marker. Literally, like the cow will look like this. Oh my God. Wait, can you look up a picture? No, we'll get it off. Political support. You also have protection of private property. Don't do it. You also have protection of private property. Europeans particularly had an idea that one's individual property is important to protect. And they had laws that protected that. They had patent sort of laws. And so people are more willing to innovate and invent because they know that they have control over that. And so that's something to consider as well when you look at political support for industrialization. Last is banking institutions. This idea that Britain especially, but also Europeans already had large banks. And these large banks, specifically in Britain, were very stable. And with stable banks, they are more willing to hand out loans. And with more banks willing to hand out loans, more people are able to buy industrial equipment, and therefore they are able to grow factories. Why Britain? For the same idea here. I'm not going to spend too much on why Britain was the first, but Britain is the first to industrialize. Kind of the same ideas. One of the main important things is that there was an ideology that developed in Britain, and that is liberal capitalism. And capitalism is developed by a man named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith believed that government intervention actually harms businesses. What really helps businesses is when they can figure out how much to supply in order to meet demand. So when people demand things, producers are going to try to supply enough to meet that. And when you can figure out that sweet spot where supply meets demand, you have a perfect market. And instead of government trying to influence businesses by putting in tariffs, by granting monopolies, you should let competition rule. Because when people don't want anything anymore, people will stop buying it. And if people stop buying things, businesses will figure out that it's not profitable. Does that make sense? And Adam Smith was the first to kind of record this as an economic theory. And this is the idea of capitalism. And this is popular by a famous song that he wrote called Laissez-Faire. That goes, laissez-faire, 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 whisper Uncle Adam, laissez-faire. Good. And we already talked about, we were talking about that. Bank of England. Good. Industrialization, what does that even mean? The rise of the machines! Eventually, Terminator will come true. The first industry to industrialize is the textile industry. You are going to see individuals who are going to invent ways that make the cotton production system go faster and smoother. And different parts of that production that makes cotton textiles is going to be improved. And eventually you will have machines that are largely separating the cotton, spinning the cotton, and making it able to produce shirts and other things way faster. Out of that is going to come an additional thing. James Watt is going to be the man who invents the steam engine. The steam engine is probably going to be one of the most important inventions of all time. And because that is not only going to cause machines to be able to produce more goods, it's also going to become the origin for locomotives or railroads, for steamships, and then eventually the car. And so improved transportation means goods can be transported faster and cheaper, and so can humans and workers. All of these are going to be fueled by fossil fuels like gas and coal. Something that I did not talk about in class enough, and it's something that Strayer kind of skips over as well, and really is probably more of an AP European history topic, but something for you to know. The Industrial Revolution essentially happens in two waves. You have the first Industrial Revolution, which is largely the textile industry, the revolution in, like I said, steam engine and transportation. But then you have a second Industrial Revolution. The first is led by Britain. The second is largely led by Germany. And this is where you're going to see chemicals, electricity, and steel being produced. And so if you ever are asked that question about a second industrialization, second industrial revolution, you know that that's going to be in electricity, chemicals, and steel. The chemicals one is going to be Marie Curie. Who is going to revolutionize the idea of vaccination? Was it Marie Curie that did vaccinations? I can never remember. I don't remember what Marie Curie did. I need to learn that before I teach you all European history. Oh, radium. So she's the one that comes. Atoms. Is that the whole idea? Yeah, she's the one that does atoms. So that's not chemicals. That has nothing to do with chemicals. But you do see vaccines getting invented during the Second Industrial Revolution. Marie Curie is one of the famous ones who does that. That's going to be 1850 and beyond. Something that the industrialization does change is the way that people work, labor techniques and systems. Around the 18th century into the early 19th century, what you had happening was called the cottage system. You as a family worked together at home. Your father and your brothers went out into the fields and worked the farm. Your mother helped take care of some of the animals and also raised the children along with your sisters. At night, you had the opportunity to own your own spinning wheel and earn a little extra money on the side. So the cottage system is quite literally the ability to work at home. This will then eventually turn into the factory system because businessmen realized as they were hiring out essentially buying per swatch of spun yarn. They would be paying per swatch, and so women were able to work as much as they wanted and produce as much as they wanted in order to earn a profit. What business owners eventually realized is, hey, what if we own the spinning wheels, and what if we make our workers come to us? Then I can tell them how much to produce, by what time that I need it. I'll tell them when to come to work. I'll let them know when they can leave. And you can control that process more. And so instead of things being in the home, work left the home. And work goes into a factory. And there were set rules. There were set regulations. One of the hardest things for factory owners to do is to get their workers to show up on time. And one of the things that were called Holy Mondays is because people got intoxicated on Sundays and then couldn't make it to work on time on Mondays, became a thing. And so workers were actually fined their wages and sometimes even given legal issues if they didn't show up to time on work. And so the factory system dramatically changes the way people work, which is why you all sit in a classroom starting promptly at 8 a.m. You have bells to know when you need to leave and move and go on to another job that you have to do. If you are late, you are fined some sort of penalty, and then you are allowed to leave at the day and go home. Yes? Yes. What, say it one more time. Oh, the machines?
No, like the people working. Like the people in factories are really
Yes, but they're able to buy basic things like clothing, and that's because goods became much cheaper. So one of the things that I hope I talk about a little bit is that right away, working actually really deteriorates, and people's lives kind of standard of living goes down. But throughout the Industrial Revolution, in general, standard of living went up. And that's largely because people were able to afford more basic necessities. People were living longer thanks to inventions in medicine and just sanitary things. But at first, not good. Yeah. Means of production owned by worker, not owned by worker, and unskilled. That is something that's important. You do see the rise of unskilled labor. What that means is it doesn't take much to work in a factory. You just need to know some little thing about how a machine works. And since you do the same thing over and over and over again, you are easily replaceable, which means you're going to be willing to work for less. That makes sense? And so that shift is a major shift because before you had skilled labor. You had people that were hired farmhands. You had people that were hired carpenters. You had people that were builders. People had specific jobs that required skills. Now, workers become largely replaceable. Urbanization is one of the major things, too. This is the explosion of cities. And cities that are going to develop extremely quickly and largely around factories. If any of you have seen the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies, that is a great depiction of Industrial Revolution London. It's gross, it's dirty, it's got slime coming out of everything, there are dead horses in the river. My favorite example of poor sanitation was the 1853 Great Stink, something in the 1850s, where members of Parliament, because the Parliament building is right along the River Thames, showed up to work and literally could not even sit there because it smelled so bad. They had to try to close all the windows. They were wearing clothespins over their nose. And finally, after Parliament was unable to work, they decided to do something about it. In addition, there was terrible sanitation because people would just pour their poop in the street. And horses and everything were left dead in the street as well. And the water supply became extremely contaminated. Therefore, a lot of people developed cholera. When you are older and more mature, you can read a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book, Love in the Time of Cholera, which is all about high schoolers' favorite things, sex and poop. And so the whole idea is death by pooping. That's what cholera is. You become so dehydrated. Because your body can't keep anything in. You eat something, you immediately poop it out. You literally die in about 4 days because everything gets sunken in. You change, and then you eventually lose all nutrition. And we've already talked about that. Impacts of industrialization. Nice. There you go. That's not so much. So, thanks. So, impacts of industrialization. The first, something to note. No. It's too hot. So, government-sponsored industrialization. Something that's important to note is in different places. If in different places you are going to have sometimes, the government running industrialization. The Industrial Revolution in Britain is largely a private event. It happens because local business owners, private business owners are the ones taking the initiative. In order to copy Britain, governments will take initiative. For example, Russia is one that industrializes from the top down. The Tsar forces, in a lot of ways, the Industrial Revolution. They literally take serfs and move them to cities and then make them work back to the country. There you go. Japan does the exact same thing. When Japan industrializes because of the Meiji Restoration, Japan industrializes largely because of a government-sponsored industrialization. So you see governments taking a larger control over the economy. Economically, wealth for the middle class, particularly the wealth for the middle class. This is going to be the era of the bourgeoisie. The 19th century is the bourgeois century. Business owners are going to become incredibly wealthy. This is when you're going to have your major business tycoons like your J.P. Morgans, your John D. Rockefellers, your Andrew Carnegies, which if you live in New York, that would make a lot more sense to all of you because you have Rockefeller Center, you have Carnegie Hall, anyway. You're like, where's that? So, another thing to know is that the aristocracy does not lose power. They don't lose power, but they do have to adapt, and they do have to get used to sharing power with the middle class. Some aristocrats, some wealthy nobles, actually begin to do the most horrid of things. They begin to work. It's terrifying. For a lot of them, it's terrifying, because for the history of the nobility, their whole pride was the ability of not working. And so some of them, especially their children, take up small businesses. It's fairly easy for them to do so because they're rich. And so they can start whatever business they want. If you watch Downton Abbey, you saw that happening towards the end when you saw that rich noble person creating his own car company. Poverty is an incredible economic issue, particularly for the poor working conditions for the working class. And then, of course, laissez-faire economics. The government largely butts out until the later part of the 19th century, when the government realizes it needs to begin to regulate and begin to protect workers and essentially protect and regulate businesses. Culturally, middle-class values become dominant. And that's very important to understand. Before, the culturally dominant class was the nobility. You wanted to be like the nobility. Everybody in the 16th and 17th and 18th century wanted to look like they were wealthy. That's why in the early modern era, people wore those crazy wigs and those crazy outfits and those crazy makeup everywhere. Even guys would wear some forms of makeup. And the whole idea was to try to make yourself look as wealthy as possible. But in the middle class, or in the modern era, it's going to be different. You want to look respectable. And so not dressing like a noble, but in fact, dressing like a middle-class person became dominant. The top hat became the fashion of the day. Walking around in a suit all the time was something that was very fashionable. Leisure time is actually invented during the 19th century because of working hours, the creation of set working hours, and being able to go home and join a bowling league or a soccer league or a rugby league or take a nice stroll around the park. This is when parks become very popular as well, and not just something for the wealthy. But you also have ideas that come out and challenge these traditions and these middle class values. Most notably, socialism and Marxism. Socialism and Marxism is going to look at laissez-faire and say that's lazy-faire, and that it should be actually the job of the government in order to heavily regulate on behalf of the working class, and that people should be living together in equality, working for the betterment of all, not this crazy income inequality that developed because of industrialization. Socially, there is this idea of class consciousness. Now, class consciousness means that you are going to know, hey, I'm part of the middle class. Hey, I'm part of the working class. Hey, I'm part of the aristocracy. Now, nobles always said they were nobles. They always do that. But the fact that people think of themselves as part of a middle class is important. And in fact, there were even conventions for people like me who were teachers who were part of the lower middle class. They would actually call themselves that. And so this idea of understanding your class. Now, class consciousness will always take a second fiddle to both Christianity and eventually to nationalism. So there is this class consciousness, but it's not necessarily something that dominates. The last thing I want to talk about is the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity. For middle class people, women were seen as saviors. Religion, much like actually the opposite of work, actually leaves the public sphere of the church and actually becomes more important in the home. And the woman was responsible for maintaining the salvation and holiness of the home, raising the children with good, respectable Christian values, making sure the home was neat and tidy and clean. And it was seen that the world outside of politics and business, that forces you to do things that you should not do. It's a dirty, dirty world out there. So women should stay inside, stay at home, create this holy space, decorate a tree around Christmas time and put lights on it. Take photographs of the meals that you make and post them all around. What? Yeah. Easy, Peter. Remember, you'll wind up not being able to do that mob mentality thing we talked about in class today. Easy. So, responses to modernization. When we look at European modernization, we also know that it's not just Europe that is going to go through and deal with these things. Something I want you to know. Anywhere modernization goes, the same effects happen. To different degrees, but the same effects will happen. The first place to respond to modernity and to have success in that is going to be Japan. Japan in the Meiji Restoration. Remember when you look at during the early modern era, Japan is pleasantly isolated. Japan kicks a lot of Europeans out of their territory, except for the Dutch. They allow the Dutch to stay. They largely kick all those Christian missionaries in an attempt to maintain their own Japanese superiority. But as Europe industrializes, and particularly as the United States industrializes, they want more access to Asian markets, and so they come a-knocking. And when Matthew Perry, the Commodore of the American Navy, comes a-knocking on Japan because he wants to be friends. So, because Matthew Perry wants to become friends, he begins to flex his muscles outside of Tokyo and completely scares the Tokugawa shogunate, who gladly signs unequal treaties with the Americans. This largely upsets the samurai warrior class, who were largely poets by this point, but somehow they organize themselves in order to stage a military coup. And they take over the government and restore Japan to its traditional emperor. That's why it's called the Meiji Restoration. They restore the emperor, Emperor Meiji, to the throne. After this, the Japanese become a state-run industrial program where they copy Westernization, they develop up their military, and they copy the industrial production that Europe had. This makes Japan the dominant Asian power. And really, even by 1905, when they whoop the Russians' butt, even puts them almost on an equal playing field with Europe. While Japan was a success, both the Ottoman Empire and China are not. The Ottoman Empire and China are also dealing with their own internal struggles. They're both falling apart, losing their territory, not being able to maintain control over the territory that they do have, and in an attempt to try to catch up with Europe, an attempt to try to regain control, they will both do reforms. In the Ottoman Empire, that's the Tanzimat reforms, and in China, that's the self-strengthening movement. Both are too little too late, and both ultimately fail. But what they do have happen is, number one, they wind up sending their children to Western-educated schools. Their children come back with Enlightenment ideas of modernity. And so both places are going to see nationalist revolutions and the end to their large empires. So, oh, there we go. Good. And I'll start with the political upheaval because that's kind of what I'm talking about. Both have nationalist revolutions. In China, eventually you see the end of the Chinese dynasty system. I mean, we're talking pre-classical era, all the way up to 1911. China had the same old system. Single all-powerful, divinely ordained emperor. Natural disasters, peasant rebellions, upheaval, a new emperor. Enemy of heaven, good, everything's good, natural disasters, peasant upheaval, new emperor. That's happened all the way. And now you have a nationalist revolution that actually brings the democracy to China for a short while. Similar things are going to happen in the Ottoman Empire, and a group that is neither known nor Turkish, called the Young Turks, are going to lead these nationalist revolts against the Ottoman Sultan. By 1918, after the Ottoman Empire loses in World War I, you are going to see an independent, modern Turkey, Ataturk, that is going to replace the former Ottoman Empire. You are going to see social shifts, both reaction for and against modernization. The Ottoman Empire, it is the conservative ulama that are not going to want to industrialize, that are going to resist. After they are crushed by the Ottoman Sultan, you are going to see this push for modernization, but eventually the Ottoman modernization is not going to go far enough. And the Young Turks and the Young Ottomans are going to push for more, but the Sultan is going to resist. In China, it's the exact opposite. The elites do not want industrialization, and the aristocratic landlord class is going to push back because they see it as a challenge to their own power. In addition, you are also going to have the lower class not wanting it either because they see it as yet another foreign incursion in China. And so you have the coolest club on campus, the Society for the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Boxers, who are going to resist any sort of Westernization. And they're going to try to kick out Europeans, and they're going to do so by claiming Chinese superiority, even Chinese superiority over Western guns. And so they will run at those guns absolutely butt naked, and well, you guessed it, they die. So the Boxers are eventually overturned, and you see again kind of upheaval in China. In both places, you will see a small, wealthy middle class develop. And we've talked a little bit about that. And because we're not running out of time totally, but because we're getting low on time, I do want to get back to imperialism. Something I want you to know about imperialism, it's an impact of industrialization. Europe does not need to have an empire unless it has a demand for resources. And that demand for resources is because of their industrial economy. Europe is by no means, when I say Europe industrializes, I don't mean that Europe totally industrializes. They're still going to have farms, you're still going to have farmers, you're still going to have agricultural production. But predominantly their economy is going to be based on producing goods, which means they want access to cheap resources cheap labor and new markets where they can sell their goods. And so they're consistently looking outward for that. And they're going to look at places that are less industrialized. This is a new form of imperialism. How Europeans used to do this is they would sail to a place, they would claim it as their own, they would send settlers there that would develop a very Europe-like society, and that would conquer natives totally. That's what you saw happening in Latin America. New imperialism is different. They use their industrial and their political and economic might in order to influence other places like in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Sometimes that will be political conquering. Other times, though, it's just going to be strong-arming and essentially signing contracts that really benefit Europe. So new imperialism is slightly different. Good. In Africa, you have the scramble as Europeans realize and are able to finally go into the middle of Africa as they have new vaccinations. There's going to be this incredible fascination for all things Africa. I was at Disneyland this weekend, and one of the rides that my wife really wanted to go on was the Jungle Cruise. And I was sitting there thinking, how pertinent to what I'm studying in class right now. Europeans were thrilled by Africa, all things Africa, because they had never been to the interior. And so there's this major push for exploration. And then while they're there, they also realize, hey, there's a lot of resources here too. And so you see European countries literally scrambling. If I threw a bag of candy on the floor right now, all of you would rise up, throw the desks, throw punches at each other. You'd see Cassie throw elbows, right? And it would be bad, right? And so you would see this major competition. That's exactly what happened in Africa. And of course, they do it in true look at all of you right now are like, God, candy. So he said candy, right? So it's really not good. And in true European fashion, they decide to divide up Africa without inviting any Africans. And so they do so in Berlin in 1880. And my favorite European during this era, Otto von Bismarck, essentially organizes a meeting where Europeans say, I'll take this territory, now I'll take this one, I'll take this one. And they create a new map of Africa, largely based off of European interests and what they wanted access and control to. There are also different ways of looking at... looking at their domination in Asia. Number one is in China. And with China, we see essentially the first real European incursion is when they realize that China no longer desires their silver. And without silver to sell, Europeans need something else to sell. Oh, I know a great idea. What if we sold them drugs? And if they got them addicted to opium, and there's a guaranteed market. Oh, and by the way, opium grows like weed. Grows like weed in India. And so with British-controlled India, you then have easy access to resources and the ability to sell to a guaranteed market. When China actually tries to resist and declare it illegal, the Europeans say, heck no, we're going to war so we can sell you drugs. And that's the Opium Wars. The result of the Opium Wars are unfair agreements, which essentially gets copied by other European powers. And you see China quite literally divided by European powers. Each of these different colors represents spheres of influence. That doesn't mean China never loses political control over themselves until 1911. But China never loses political control over themselves. But what they do lose is economic controls in these regions. This pink region means that the resources in this area could only go to Britain. That makes sense? And the Portuguese largely get the Taklamakan Desert, suckers, and other places get different spheres of influence. In the Ottoman Empire, economic influence was seen in these capitulation agreements. European merchants could travel anywhere they wanted in the Ottoman Empire and do whatever they wanted. They were not subject to Ottoman law, which is fairly incredible. I don't think murder would have been off the case, but imagine being able to steal something and not get in trouble for it. The British East India Company in South Asia is largely going to take control through different treaties and negotiations, and pinning Hindu princes against the Mughal dynasty and against each other. And by doing so, they're going to largely come to dominate a majority of the Indian subcontinent by the middle of the 19th century. And this is most notably seen in direct versus indirect control. In some places, you will see direct European control. Europeans will send governors over from Europe to rule over their subjects. In other places, you are going to see Europeans largely acting as puppeteers and using local native rulers in order to do their bidding. Does that make sense? Don't forget Oceania, because I always forget that one. Australia and New Zealand are both settler colonies. Those are more the traditional types. Australia starts out as a prison colony. That's where they would send all of their worst, which is why Australia. And then New Zealand has one of the most successful resistance to European invaders with the Maori Revolt. However, still. Our last slide, then we're going to get to our essay, because I know you guys are getting tired of listening to me speak. Oh, yeah, sorry, Sam. The impacts of imperialism. First thing to note are the economic impacts of imperialism. And what you're going to see is a lot of these colonies, they are going to begin to shift their economies to develop crops that Europeans want, and particularly that are easy to grow and can be easily translated into cash. These are going to be cash crops. And certain colonies are going to depend upon Europeans buying these cash crops. Things like rubber, cotton, or even mining metals. Rubber, especially in the Belgian Congo, is going to be a cash crop, where most people in the Belgian Congo will be switching their economy to producing rubber. What happens when Europeans are able to get that same resource for cheaper in another one of their colonies? Good, Bailey. Not good things, Mr. Optional. That means that people are no longer able to earn a living because they're dependent upon one crop. And so what that does for many of these colonies is create a dependent development. In some places, you'll see a decline of agriculture. Probably the most important thing is the creation of a new Western elite. In all of these colonies, those who are already wealthy, those who are already elites, are going to get all of the benefits of being part of a European empire. They're going to be able to get Western education. They're going to be able to go to Cambridge and Oxford. They're going to get access to all Western technology. They will begin to talk like Europeans. They will begin to dress like Europeans. They will be given extra respect over a lot of the other people and the ability to maintain control in their own places. This will eventually bite Europeans in the butt in the postmodern era when Western educated elites like Gandhi begin to say, hey, I thought you said that a government should represent the people. Europeans don't represent Indians. Get out. Thanks, one person laughs. Must be chemistry. Poverty for many under colonial rule, including slavery. Thanks, Zach. Probably the most horrific example of this is actually in Belgian-controlled Congo. The King of Belgium, King Leopold, I believe it's Leopold III, it has his own private colony in the Congo. Belgium as a country does not control them. It is his. And he has a successful rubber business based off of the gathering of rubber from the Congo. If people in the Congo did not bring enough rubber, he would have their hands cut off, which is why you see a picture of these Africans holding other Africans' hands. And so if you see in your textbook picture, there were those children whose hands were cut off, and they're sitting there, and you probably didn't even realize it, because you're like, oh, that's a cute picture, and then you realize they have no hands. And that was seen as a way of coercing people to get more rubber for King Leopold. Ryan, can you please ask that question louder so everybody hears that? Because that's a phenomenal question. Ryan, excellent. I put slavery in quotes because slavery is abolished. It's not legal for any European country to do so, so there had to be some other form of coerced labor. So these Africans were not slaves, but if you don't produce rubber, we cut your hand off. So they're not necessarily property, but they're going to be free labor. A great question, Ryan. That's an excellent question and something I forgot to say. I mentioned it earlier. I'll talk to you again about it. One of the biggest impacts of the Industrial Revolution is the incredible amount of migration that occurs. And this happens actually for Europe itself. As many places in Southern and Eastern Europe lose a lot of their prominence in agriculture because of easy access to goods, you are going to see a mass migration to the United States. This is what makes New York, New York. This is what makes, especially people on the East Coast, have bumper stickers with all their ethnic heritage. Like I have a Norwegian sticker on the back of my car, and all of my classmates in high school had Italian or Irish or both stickers on their car. It was really cool. They actually had reflectors, and that was like the it thing on your cool silver 2000 Mustang was to have. Anyway, you see migrations from Europe, but you also see migrations around to European empires. You're going to see Indian migration to South Africa. You are going to see Japanese migration after Japan has a huge shoot up in their population and no jobs. They actually convince people to move to Brazil for some reason, and that's like actually a really weird thing. But you do see migrations happening all around the world because of easier transportation. Good! All right, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and, on the NEO class, go ahead and pull up the rubric. The essay rubric. Thank you, Dylan. I'm going to have to figure that out. Nice, it does work. Okay, so, Axel, do me a favor, hit those lights. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you go to resources, and you go to essay formats, and you go to the LEQ, and you look at the LEQ rubrics, and you scroll all the way down to page 6. This is our last day talking about the LEQ. Center Resources. This is our last day talking about the LEQ. So, the good news about the LEQ is that all of the different types of essays we've been talking about have the same exact format. You write an intro paragraph of the thesis, you have 2 body paragraphs that describe whatever the skill is and then provide an analysis statement, and then you have your conclusion paragraph that restates your thesis and provides a synthesis. We are looking